A lioness collapsed at the feet of a grizzly bear. Not to attack, not to run, to beg. Her cub was dying behind her, and she had no strength left to fight or flee. What the bear did next wasn't just unnatural, it was unthinkable. In the wild, mercy has no place. But that night, in a forgotten corner of the Bitterroot Mountains, nature broke its own rules. The sun was setting over the northern rim of the Bitterroot Mountains, casting a golden hue that turned the forest into a canvas of light and shadow. At this hour, everything felt still, reverent almost, as if the wilderness was holding its breath. But silence in the wild doesn't mean safety. It often means something is watching. Through the high pines, a massive grizzly bear lumbered slowly, each step deliberate, heavy with age and weight. His name was Boone, named by the rangers who had seen him over the years. He was known not for his ferocity, but for something rarer in his kind, restraint. He had once been seen sharing a riverbank with a pack of coyotes. Another time he had stood calmly as elk passed close by, their fawns trailing behind. But Boone wasn't soft. The scars along his flanks told stories of battles most had never seen. He had survived winters that snapped smaller predators in half. He had earned his place through blood, but not by seeking it. And yet on this evening something in the wind stopped him. A sound carried through the trees, thin, sharp, panicked. Not a challenge, not a warning, a plea. It was the sound of a mother. Boone froze, head lifting, his nostrils flared. There was something else, too. Fear, sickness, and desperation carried on the breeze. He turned his massive head toward a clearing below. That's when he saw her. A lioness, emaciated, bleeding, her coat torn and dulled by days of struggle, stumbled into the clearing. Her breaths came in shuddering bursts, her eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. She didn't belong here. This was no savanna. She was clearly out of place, perhaps escaped from some defunct wildlife enclosure or released illegally into the wild where she never should have been. Behind her, a cub, a tiny thing barely standing, wavered like a leaf in the wind. It coughed once, a wheezing, painful sound, then collapsed in the tall ferns. And between them stood Boone. For a heartbeat, the forest was held still by the impossible tableau. A lioness and a grizzly, two apex predators, two rulers of very different kingdoms. She should have fled. He should have charged. But the lioness did something no one expected. She crawled, not with stealth, not with aggression, but with humility. Her legs gave way more than once, her chest scraping the earth, her eyes never leaving Boone's. She crawled toward him, then stopped just feet away, lowered her head to the dirt, and whimpered. It wasn't a sound lions made often. It was low, pleading, a vibration that pulsed through the ground more than the air. It was the sound of surrender, of desperation, of a mother. Boone didn't move. Behind the lioness, the cub let out another faint sound and then went still. Its sides barely rose with each breath, poisoned perhaps, bitten, wounded, dying. And then Boone did the impossible. He stepped forward, not with the speed of an attack, but with the weight of choice. Each paw landed with a muffled thud, leaves scattering under his bulk. He approached the cub directly. The lioness didn't move to stop him. She flinched, yes, but made no sound, no motion. Her eyes were shut tight as though bracing for the end. Boone lowered his massive head. He sniffed the cub once. Then he sat down. Not to rest, not to feed, to guard. For a moment, the lioness didn't seem to understand. She blinked, raised her head slightly. She looked at the bear, then at her cub, then slowly crawled forward again until she reached them both. With what little strength she had left, she pressed her muzzle against her cub's side and collapsed fully, this time not in fear, but in trust. The bear had become her shield. Above them, a red-tailed hawk circled once, screeched, and flew off. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The air was cooling, thunder rumbled distantly. But in that clearing, three creatures, who should never have met, let alone touched, lay in a fragile triangle of silence. And then Boone stood. The lioness tensed, but he didn't leave. He moved off the trail, nose lifted to the air. He sniffed, searched, dug briefly beneath a tree root, and moments later returned carrying something in his jaws. A crushed plant, fibrous and muddy, wild ginseng or angelica, both known among herbalists and some indigenous medicine for their purifying and immune-boosting properties. He dropped it beside the cub. The lioness didn't touch it, but she didn't stop him. The cub stirred once, just enough to twitch its paw. Boone lowered himself again, this time with effort, groaning slightly under the weight of his own age and hidden wounds. He rested near them, his bulk between the tree line and the fragile pair, and the forest held its breath. Thunder cracked above the bitterroot pines as wolves circled a dying lion cub. His mother couldn't move. His only hope? A wounded grizzly bear standing alone against the pack. What happened next wasn't about strength, it was about sacrifice, and it would shake the foundations of what we believe wild animals are capable of. The wind shifted. What had been a quiet evening turned heavy and damp, the air thick with coming rain. Boone remained still, his massive frame hunched protectively near the lioness and her cub. His breathing was slow but steady. He watched the tree line with eyes that missed nothing. The lioness drifted in and out of shallow sleep. She was broken in body but not in instinct. Every sound in the forest stirred her ears, every crack of a branch sent a jolt through her spine. Yet she did not move away from the bear. In some part of her, primal and deep, she understood. This creature was no longer a threat. He was her only defense. The cub's breathing remained shallow. Occasionally it let out a faint cry, more a whisper than a sound. The root Boone had brought lay beside it, damp and crushed. Whether it had any healing power, no one could know for certain. But Boone had tried. And then the storm came. The first drops fell like warnings, sharp, cold taps on leaves and fur. Then the sky broke open and rain poured in sheets, turning the forest floor to mud and shadow. The storm lashed through the trees with ferocity, tearing at branches and flattening undergrowth. Boone did not move. He stood over the cub and lioness like a living monument. His fur soaked quickly, becoming matted and heavy, but still he didn't budge. Water streamed down his snout and over his scars. He blinked only to keep the sting out of his eyes. Thunder boomed overhead. The lioness curled tighter around her cub. She whimpered with each lightning flash. But the bear stood like stone. Predators don't normally protect prey. They don't comfort. They don't shelter. But in this moment, Boone wasn't acting like a predator. He was acting like something older, something instinctual, not driven by hunger or dominance, but by something the textbooks don't mention: empathy. Hours passed. Lightning flickered constantly now, the kind that doesn't wait for thunder. The air smelled of wet bark, pine, and something else: danger. Boone's ears twitched. He raised his head and sniffed deeply. His muscles tightened. Something was coming. From the trees to the east, shadows moved. Low, fast, silent. Wolves. Graybacks, thin from the late season, their ribs visible beneath coarse fur, driven from higher elevations by the storm. They had caught scent of something unnatural, something vulnerable. A lion cub, a mother unable to fight, and a bear wounded. Boone stepped forward. He left the cover of the trees and moved to higher ground at the edge of the clearing. The wind whipped around him. Rain blurred his outline, but his silhouette, massive, scarred, unmoving, rose like a guardian in the dark. The wolves fanned out. They didn't charge, not yet. They tested the space. One, a younger male, crept forward, tail low, teeth bared. Boone didn't move until the wolf was close enough to leap. Then the bear exploded. He let out a roar that cracked through the forest louder than thunder. Trees seemed to shiver from the force of it. The wolf skidded back, ears pinned, but did not retreat. The others had heard the roar and understood it wasn't just sound. It was declaration. This place is mine. Boone held his ground. Behind him, the lioness tried to rise. Her legs trembled. She pushed herself halfway up before collapsing again. A quiet snarl escaped her throat, but it was hollow. She had nothing left to give. Boone looked back at her once. Then he made his choice. He ran toward the wolves. What followed was a storm within the storm. Rain flying, fur tearing, snarls, roars, chaos. Boone swung his great paws like hammers, striking one wolf with such force it hit a tree and didn't rise. Another lunged for his flank, biting deep. Boone roared in pain, spun, and tore it loose with his jaws. Blood mixed with rain on the ground. His shoulder bled, his front paw was torn, but still he fought. The wolves were fast but not foolish. Boone was alone, but he was not prey, not yet. And then came the final blow. Boone reared onto his hind legs, towering over the pack. With one deafening bellow, he charged again, not to chase, but to claim. His voice was not rage, it was finality. It said, "This ground, this life, is not yours to take." The wolves paused, then one by one they vanished into the dark, not defeated, but denied. The clearing fell silent again. Boone stood, panting. His body shook. Blood flowed freely from his shoulder, a deep gash where teeth had torn through thick hide. His paw was injured, each step now a limp, but still he returned. He limped back to the lioness and collapsed beside her. He didn't make a sound. The cub whimpered faintly and nestled closer to its mother. Boone let out a low grunt and rested his head beside theirs. The storm began to fade. Rain turned from a fury to a whisper. Thunder rolled away. The clouds began to lighten, just enough for the moon to filter through broken tree limbs and shine down on the battered trio. In that forest, a choice had been made. Not the choice of instinct, not survival of the fittest. The choice of mercy. When the ranger stepped into the clearing, he reached for his rifle. What he saw made him freeze. A grizzly bear soaked in blood, lying beside a lioness and her cub, not killing, not fighting, protecting. The rules of the wild had shattered, and now a man with a weapon had to decide, intervene, or witness the impossible. Dawn broke quietly over the Bitterroot Mountains. It wasn't the kind of sunrise that blazed into brilliance. It came softly, gold light filtering through branches still dripping with rain. The forest floor steamed gently, the heat from the soil rising to meet the cool of the fading storm. Birds did not sing, not yet. The wilderness was still holding its breath. In the clearing, Boone lay curled, his back pressed against the lioness. Blood had crusted on his shoulder and paw. His body was stiff, the muscles beneath his thick coat locked in a bruised, battered silence. Yet his chest still rose and fell, slow and steady. The lioness stirred. Her ribs ached with every breath, but they weren't broken. Her head lifted, weakly at first, and her eyes found the small, fragile body between her front legs, the cub, alive. She nuzzled it gently. The cub let out a small moan, stirred, and rolled toward her belly. It was still weak, still quiet, but the life had not gone out. And beside them the bear remained. Not guarding now, just existing. His wounds spoke of sacrifice. His position, protective, close, and without tension, spoke of something else entirely. He had chosen them. Not far from the clearing, boots squelched in mud. A man emerged from the trail, raincoat still damp from the night storm. His name was Mason Rivers. Park ranger for nearly 2 decades. He had tracked wolves, relocated moose, even airlifted injured black bears to medical units. But he had never seen anything like this. Locals had called in strange noises, roars and screams during the storm. Mason had followed the trail with low expectations, expecting a bear fight or maybe a poaching incident. But what he found left him motionless. 30 feet ahead, a grizzly bear, massive and battered, lay beside a lioness, a real lioness. Her coat was streaked with blood and mud. Between them, a tiny cub. Mason's breath caught. His hand reflexively brushed the tranquilizer rifle slung over his back. Protocol demanded it. A grizzly this close? A non-native predator like a lion? A cub? Everything about this scene screamed danger. But none of them moved. The lioness saw him first. Her ears twitched at the sound of his boots in the wet earth. She lifted her head but made no attempt to flee. Her eyes were tired, but calm. Then Boone opened his. Their gazes locked. Mason had been around bears long enough to recognize signs of stress, aggression, fear. But what he saw in Boone's face was none of those. It was something older, deeper. Recognition, not of Mason as a man, but of his presence, a being, a witness. And so Mason did the only thing that felt right. He crouched, slowly, calmly, his hands open, his movements small. He didn't speak, not at first. He just watched. Minutes passed. The sun rose higher, casting long beams of light into the clearing. One of them landed directly on the cub's side, warming the tiny lion as it began to breathe a little deeper. Mason finally reached for his satellite phone. He dialed slowly. When the sanctuary's mobile vet unit answered, he whispered, "You're not going to believe what I've found. And no, I'm not intervening. Not yet. I think they're taking care of each other." It took the team hours to arrive. When they did, they stayed far back. Mason remained the only one in the clearing, a go-between. He spoke gently, walked slowly, and laid out a steel bowl filled with clean water a few feet from the lioness. She didn't move, but Boone did. The bear sniffed it first. Then, stunning everyone watching, he nudged the bowl forward, toward the cub. The lioness leaned down. She licked her cub's ear. It whimpered, blinked, then weakly drank. A gasp escaped someone watching from the trees. Boone groaned and shifted his weight, collapsing again with a grunt. The wounds on his shoulder were crusted but raw. He was in pain, but he stayed. And so did the lioness. Mason watched, scribbling notes in a small pad, though the words felt meaningless in the face of what he was seeing. These weren't facts to report. They were something else. He looked down at what he'd written. Only one word stood out: mercy. A sanctuary director arrived by helicopter, ready to end the miracle. "We need to separate them," she said. "A lioness, a cub, a grizzly, 3 species that should never coexist." But when she looked through the binoculars, her voice broke, because what she saw wasn't a survival fluke. It was a family. 2 days passed. The forest surrounding the clearing had grown still, as if it too were holding back any disruption. The rangers had cordoned off the area without fences, posting a silent perimeter half a mile out. No humans entered except for Mason Rivers, and even he moved like a ghost among the trees, only approaching to lay down fresh water or meat at a respectful distance. The unspoken rule was clear now. Do not disturb the bond. Because what was forming in that muddy clearing wasn't just rare, it was redefining everything the rangers thought they knew. The lioness had gained some strength. She no longer collapsed after every movement. Her ribs still showed beneath her coat, but she had begun licking her cub with a devotion that hadn't waned since the first moment she arrived. She even allowed Boone, the bloodied bear who had defended them, to lay his head close, sometimes resting it gently beside hers. The cub had rallied, though not completely. It still trembled on occasion and slept more than it stirred, but its eyes were brighter. It began to pounce on pine cones clumsily and bat at Boone's fur with little swats of its paws. And each time it cried or whimpered, Boone responded, a shift of his massive body, a snort, a soft nudge from his snout. The grizzly bear and the lioness had found a rhythm. Mason, watching from behind the tree line, took notes but didn't bother sending them in. The bear defers to the lioness trusts the bear, the cub trusts both. He wrote it again, underlined it, still didn't believe it. But the wild wasn't waiting for human approval. Boone's wounds had begun to clot, his shoulder remained swollen, and one paw was clearly infected, forcing him to limp heavily. But his eyes were sharp. Every hour or so he stood, scanned the tree line, and sniffed the air like a sentinel. He wasn't resting. He was guarding. The sanctuary's mobile unit, led by a junior vet named Clara, remained stationed well back. They kept a drone hovering at tree height, silent, no buzzing, but it captured everything. Every nuzzle, every twitch of muscle, every glance shared between predator and predator that somehow no longer seemed like enemies. Then, on the 3rd morning, a helicopter landed at the nearest clearing. Out stepped Dr. Lisa Firth. She was the director of the state's wildlife sanctuary program, a woman known for her pragmatism, her calm, and her refusal to be swayed by emotion. She had overseen dozens of species relocations, predator interventions, and conflict neutralizations. She was also the final word on what happened next. Mason met her near the outer trail. She didn't waste time. "This can't continue," she said. 3 apex predators sharing space is a formula for tragedy. We need to relocate the lioness and the cub. The bear's too injured to move, but they aren't. Mason didn't argue. He simply handed her the binoculars. "Just look," he said. Dr. Firth sighed, raised the lenses, and froze. Through the glass, she saw something no wildlife textbook had ever prepared her for. Boone, curled on his uninjured side, was allowing the cub to climb over his back. The lioness lay beside him, eyes half closed, her tail flicking lightly across the bear's hip. There was no tension, no territorial aggression, just breath, warmth, proximity. She lowered the binoculars slowly, her lips parted, but no words came out. Then finally she said, "Wait, No further commands were issued, no darts, no crates, no separation plan. The protocol had shifted. That afternoon, something changed in the clearing. It began subtly. The lioness stood, this time without shaking. Her cub followed her unsteadily. Boone lifted his head and watched them carefully. She looked at him long and still. Then she nudged her cub gently forward toward the trees. Boone stood. Mason and Dr. Firth moved quietly from their post, tracking the movement from a safe distance. The three animals, Lioness, Cub, and Grizzly, walked together until they reached a natural fork in the forest. One trail led west toward the open lowlands where sanctuary staff could intercept them safely. The other led deeper into the dense woods Boone called home. At the fork, the lioness stopped. Boone stopped beside her. They didn't touch, but they stood close enough that the space between them held weight. The cub looked up at them both, unsure, then leaned briefly into Boone's leg before turning back to its mother. And then, silently, the lioness licked Boone's face once, then turned. She led her cub down the western trail without hesitation, toward safety, toward people, toward whatever life lay ahead. Boone stood watching until they disappeared. Only then did he turn, limp slightly, and disappear back into the trees. No sedation. Just choice. Dr. Firth exhaled slowly. They decided better than we ever could, she said. The forest around them echoed with nothing but wind in the needles. The wild, it seemed, had made its point. They walked away without a sound. No fight, no chase. A lioness, her cub, and a grizzly bear parted like old friends at a forest crossroads. But the story didn't end there, because what happened next didn't live in the animals. It grew in the hearts of the people who saw them, and it changed everything. The forest was quiet again. No thunder, no wolves, no blood in the ferns, just the echo of something sacred, something nearly invisible but deeply felt by every person who had stood at the edge of that clearing. Boone had returned to the deep woods. Rangers lost track of him within days. His paw prints faded between the river banks and ridgelines of the Bitterroot Mountains. No one collared him. No one tried. Some stories, like some creatures, are meant to roam freely. The lioness and her cub were intercepted by a wildlife team a mile down the western path. The team did not sedate them. They followed slowly, quietly, until the lioness led them to an open glade where she simply stopped and lay down. Her cub climbed onto her back, watching the humans with wide, unafraid eyes. They were guided to the sanctuary by vehicle. No crates, no cages, just open beds lined with warm blankets and care. Vets confirmed what Mason had suspected. The cub had survived a venomous snake bite. The only reason it had lived was the warmth, shelter, and time given by the bear. Without Boone, it would have died. The lioness adapted quickly to the sanctuary. But she never joined the others. When released into a large open compound with other rescued lions, she stayed at the edges, always near the fence line, always beneath the trees. She did not fight, she did not play, she simply watched the sky, as if waiting. The cub, named Tamu, meaning gentle in Swahili, grew fast. Strong but different. Caretakers noticed it within weeks. Tamu did not fight over food, he shared. He let smaller cubs eat first. He often pressed close to the sick or injured, laying beside them as if standing guard. One spring, an injured deer wandered into the outer sanctuary perimeter, limping and disoriented. While others roared, Tamu approached silently and laid beside it. The deer didn't flee. It just trembled, and Tamu rested his chin on the ground, saying nothing. No one taught him that, but he had seen it once from a bear. Back at the ranger station, Mason Rivers couldn't let go of what he'd witnessed. He'd spent years writing reports about behavior, conservation threats, population stats, but none of it felt relevant anymore. So he changed. He started filming short videos not of predator attacks or tranquilizer rescues, but of moments. A hawk circling a newborn elk, a fox carrying its kit through snow, a moose waiting patiently while its calf played in a frozen stream. He called the series The Quiet Choice. The title came from that moment in the forest when Boone could have chosen instinct and didn't. The videos spread, first among teachers, then parents, then schools. One clip of Tamu lying beside an injured rabbit went viral. The caption read, He doesn't know what mercy means. He just knows how it feels. But it wasn't just Mason who changed. Dr. Lisa Firth, the woman who had once arrived ready to separate three apex predators with military precision, found herself rethinking the very core of her career. She submitted a full report to the Wildlife Board. It was 37 pages long. Data, analysis, drone footage. But in her conclusion, she wrote a single sentence that shook the board to silence. Sometimes the wild teaches us ethics we haven't earned yet. She recommended a new policy: observation before intervention, a reversal of decades-old protocols that had prioritized human control over natural decision-making. To everyone's surprise, it passed. But perhaps the most profound change came from someone no one expected. A boy named Elijah, 7 years old, nonverbal, diagnosed with severe anxiety and animal-related trauma. His parents had tried therapy, medication, exposure sessions. Nothing worked. Then one day, Elijah saw a video of Boone and the Lioness standing beside each other in the rain. He watched it over and over. Then he asked his parents, using a device, to take him to that place. They drove 12 hours. At the sanctuary, Elijah refused to go near the animals. But when they took him down the trail where the clearing had once been, he stopped. He sat under the tall pine where the lioness had nursed her cub, where Boone had stood like a statue in the storm. He touched the soil, closed his eyes, and then for the first time in his life he smiled. He looked at the empty clearing and whispered one word: bear. No one could explain why that word, why then, why there. But something had been left behind in that forest. Not tracks, not blood, not claw marks. Something unseen. A trail of mercy. A child spoke his first word beneath a pine tree. A lion shared her den with ghosts, and a bear disappeared into legend. What happened in that forest didn't just touch animals, it took root in the hearts of people. And like all real miracles, it didn't fade. It grew, quietly, until the world couldn't ignore it anymore. Years passed. The trail to the clearing became something of a pilgrimage site, unofficial, unadvertised, and yet deeply known. Rangers didn't put up signs. They didn't need to. People came. They came with cameras, with walking sticks, with children. They came in silence, walking the winding trail that once held wolves and storm water, and a choice that no animal should have had to make. But Boone had made it, and the forest remembered. The sanctuary adapted too. Where once its mission was protect and contain, a new philosophy emerged, carved slowly from the roots of what had happened. Protect, observe, connect. They trained their volunteers differently now, not just in animal handling or enclosure safety, but in patience, in presence, in witnessing. One sign hung above the volunteer dormitory. It read, "Before you act, ask, is this fear or is this habit?" Because that's what Boone had undone, the habit of fear, the automatic assumptions of violence, of rivalry, of survival at all costs. He had waited. He had watched. He had chosen mercy, and others had followed. The lioness, now known as Amara, never reintegrated with the other big cats. She lived at the sanctuary's outer rim, close to the tree line. Staff respected her boundaries. She allowed caretakers to bring food, accepted their presence with quiet tolerance, but she never played the role of captive. She lived on her terms. Tamu, her cub, became a symbol. He grew tall and lean, with amber eyes that always seemed to be watching something just behind the horizon. Visitors were drawn to him, not for his size, but for his strange gentleness. He didn't roar often, but once during a storm, when thunder rolled over the sanctuary and wind whipped through the trees, Tamu stood at the fence line and let out a single long sound, not anger, not fear, something else. A call, and the staff who heard it said it didn't sound like a lion. It sounded like a bear. Some nights Amara would sit beside him beneath the pines. They didn't need words, they had memory. And somewhere beyond the sanctuary fences, Boone still lived. His sightings were rare. Motion-triggered cameras near high ridges would occasionally catch a glimpse, a massive silhouette by a stream, or a flash of scarred fur moving between rocks. One spring, a park volunteer hiking alone near the northern border of the preserve found a fresh bear print beside a crushed root, Angelica, the same kind Boone had once dragged into the clearing for the cub. The volunteer didn't report it to headquarters. She just knelt beside it, whispered, "Thank you," and turned back. Because by now people understood, some stories aren't meant to be managed. They're meant to be remembered. Mason Rivers, the ranger who had first witnessed Boone's act of compassion, retired from field duty and took up storytelling full-time. He spoke at schools, community centers, and even state wildlife conferences. But he didn't show graphs or predator maps. He showed pictures of the clearing. The three animals curled beside each other, the soft eyes of the cub. And the words that always followed were the same. This isn't fiction, it's just rare. He carried a worn journal with him everywhere. On the first page, written in careful block letters, was the same single word he'd written in the clearing that day. Mercy. Dr. Firth, once the champion of containment policies, became one of the leading voices in cross-species trauma research. She argued that wild animals, especially those in rescue or displacement, could form emotional bonds previously dismissed by science. "We talk about instinct like it's a wall," she once said during a lecture, "but sometimes instinct opens a door. The question is, will we walk through it with them?" Her research inspired changes in sanctuary design. New soft zones were created, transitional areas where animals could observe one another without barriers, not forced into interaction, but allowed to choose. And again, unlikely bonds began to form. A young cougar and an orphan black bear. A wolf dog and a rescued fox. A nonverbal boy and a sleeping lion cub. Each one made headlines, but to those who'd been in the bitter root when Boone made his choice, none of it was surprising. Because they'd seen the blueprint. They had watched it happen under stormlight. And they'd never be the same. No one ever saw Boone again, but that didn't mean he was gone. His presence remained, not in fur, not in footprint, but in choices made by those he never met. The bear who once stood between death and mercy didn't just change the forest, he changed the future, and the wild remembered. The clearing was never developed. No fences, no camera towers, no wildlife encounter zone signs, just one small wooden plaque nailed gently to a post shaped like a tree branch, weather-worn, handmade. It read, "Here the wild chose kindness." Above it, mounted in iron and rust, was a sculpture, a roaring bear, not with its claws raised, but with its head turned slightly towards something unseen, like it was listening, watching, waiting. Visitors stopped there, not because it was flashy, but because something about the silence in that patch of trees felt different, like the forest itself was holding a story just beneath its roots. A story you didn't hear with ears. You felt it, in the way the light came through the branches, in the way the wind never rushed, in the hush of footfalls that grew quiet without being asked, and always in the stillness. No ranger had to say, "Be respectful." The trees said it for them. Amara passed away on a cold morning 5 years later. She had lived longer than expected for a lion in captivity, especially one who had arrived injured, half-starved, and carrying the trauma of displacement. She had never fully bonded with any other lions, but she'd known peace. She died beneath the same pine she had once chosen to raise her cub in. Staff found her curled in the needles, her body calm, her breath slow, her eyes closed as if she'd only just drifted off. And lying beside her, resting its head gently against her flank, was Tamu. No one had needed to tell him. He just knew. They buried her at the edge of the forest. No stone, no fence, just a circle of wildflowers and a branch shaped like a crescent moon. Tamu changed after that. Not in anger, not in grief, in purpose. He became the sanctuary's silent guardian. Rangers swore he had memorized every footstep. He still nuzzled the young, shared his food, watched the tree line. But now he watched longer. One evening, during a tour for educators, a young girl asked the guide, "Why doesn't that lion play like the others?" The guide smiled. "Because he learned something different," she said. "He didn't grow up with roars, he grew up with silence, with watching, with mercy." Tamu became a symbol around the world. His image appeared on children's books, conservation posters, even medallions used in trauma-informed animal care training, but he never seemed to care about the attention. He still spent his days in the shadows of trees, always near that old pine. One summer, a motion-triggered camera deep in the Bitterroot Mountains captured something. Just a glimpse. A bear, massive, lumbering, crossing a stream at dawn. Older now, scarred, but unmistakably Boone. The photo was sent to the sanctuary anonymously. No name, no message, just one caption scribbled on the back. Still watching. Mason, now retired and living in a cabin near the sanctuary, framed the photo and placed it above his fireplace. Every year he made the walk to the clearing. He never spoke there. He just stood listening, as if the forest still carried Boone's breath in its trees. One day a new ranger fresh out of school asked him, "Why do people come here? It's just a spot in the woods." Mason chuckled, then looked around the clearing. "That's what it looks like," he said. "But this isn't just where it happened. This is where it started." The ranger frowned. "What started?" Smiled. "A different kind of wild. Because the real legacy wasn't just the mercy shown in that clearing. It was in the schoolboy who said bear as his first word. In the sanctuary volunteer who changed careers to become a wildlife grief counselor. In the state law rewritten to allow for emotional coexistence in predator policies. In the professor who added an ethics module titled Instinct and Empathy to her biology curriculum. In the hundreds of visitors who left the forest quieter than when they entered. And in the boy named Elijah, now 14, who every summer returned to sit beneath the pine tree that had once sheltered the lioness and her cub. He never needed many words, but one day, as he stood at the base of the iron bear sculpture, he turned to his mother and whispered, "He didn't leave." She nodded, fighting tears. "I know," because the truth was, Boone was still there. Not in body, but in every moment when an animal paused instead of pounced. In every ranger who watched instead of reacted. In every human who finally understood that even the wild has room for gentleness. So when people ask if the story is real, tell them yes. Tell them it's more than real. Tell them it's alive. Because some stories don't end. They become the forest.